Alright, this is the first video in the Civium series, and I guess by nature it's going to be a little bit broader than is appropriate for this particular kind of venue, because I have to provide at least a little bit of context is what I'm talking about. Hopefully in the future we'll actually be able to go back and recreate this particular video to be more, I guess, specific. So context. The notion of the Civium Project is based upon a premise and a possibility. So the premise is that the city is foundational to the nature of what I've called game A, or to the fundamental basis or the toolkit that gives rise to the kinds of civilizations that human beings have thus far been able to create. So I'm making a proposition that city is more fundamental than civilization. The possibility that I am proposing is that we are now within a threshold. We are now near to a point where we can, in fact, innovate a new way of living together that is different. It's a different basis than the city. And therefore, and thereby, that transition is fundamental. It moves us from one basis that gives rise to an entire architecture of civilizations to potentially a very different one. Which, if we wanted to use that language, we could say game B, although I suppose I'm a bit ambivalent about that these days. So, let me get into the depth of this particular piece. This piece is about the first proposition and some of the context around that. And to do that, I have to go into a little bit of depth. So this video is probably going to be on the order of like 10 or 12 minutes. I apologize for the length. The core theory here comes from work that was done largely around the Santa Fe Institute, largely with people like Jeffrey West and Louise Betancourt and many others. And you can read about it actually in the book called Scale that Jeffrey West produced in the past couple of years. And I'll just give a brief summary to kind of compress the piece that I think is most relevant. What they were looking at was particular characteristics that are called scaling laws, which is to say if I increase some particular characteristic, like let's say, for example, I have a one brick, and that brick weighs 1 pound, and I increase one characteristic. So I increase from 1 brick to 10 bricks. So in this case, I'm increasing number. How many pounds do I have? Well, in the case of bricks, it's a linear scaling law. So if I have gone from 1 brick to 10 bricks, I've gone from 1 pound to 10 pounds. And they were looking at various, all kinds of different systems in nature and looking at what kinds of scaling laws were there. And what they found was that there was a very profound fundamental that in many important characteristics, like, for example, the ratio between body mass and metabolism, or body mass and like the amount of vascular tissue, like how long was your vascular system, if you kind of could lay it all out and measure it, that there was an extraordinary regularity of what are called sublinear scaling laws, and very specifically, in fact, 0.85, which is to say, for example, if I have a mouse that weighs 100 grams and it has, like, let's say, metabolic rate X, and I double its mass to 200 grams, I don't, in fact, double its metabolism. In fact, instead of increasing by 100%, I increase it by only 85%. More or less. Like, I'm just trying to broad brush into the zone here. And the sublinear scaling is very fundamentally characteristic. You might even say it's like at the very heart of living systems, specifically dissipative systems, I think. But in any event, living systems. So whether you're looking at cells or organisms, whether you're looking at mammals or reptiles, whether you're looking at, by the way, trees or forests, right, entire ecosystems that are multi-species, you still see this exact same kind of sublinear scaling dynamic. And that's huge. It's an enormously important finding. And it talks about, for example, how systems have limits to growth built in. Elephants are kind of as big as they're going to get. Blue whales are as big as they're going to get in the context of that particular niche, for example. And when they went and started looking at human systems, they found that human systems also, more or less, and I'm going to give you the exception in a minute, fell under the same rules. So if I take a corporation and I add more people, I don't, for example, increase revenue per person linearly. It actually increases on kind of like an asymptote. So when I go from 1,000 people to 2,000 people, I don't double the revenue per person. In fact, I tend to actually, each per capita input reduces, which means that corporations have a natural asymptote. At a certain point, you're just not getting any more productivity. of the individuals that you're adding into the system. We also see in, for example, cities, that if you take a look at the population of a city and you look at, for example, the length of roads in the city, or the sort of length total measure of, say, telephone lines or sewers, the same basic characteristic. If I double the population of a city, the amount of the length of roads does not double. It increases by 85%. Okay, that's cool. So what that's saying is that these human-built systems are very much like biological systems. So a city is like, in this context, a city is like a forest. But, and this but is the point of this video, frankly the point of the entire series, to be perfectly frank, with regard to other characteristics, cities, and only in cities, did they find not a sublinear scaling metric, but a superlinear scaling metric. So what that means, what it meant, was that with regard to something like, say, income per capita, so I've got a city of 1 million, and everybody makes, let's just say on average, $10,000 a month. If I double the population of the city, the per capita income goes up by about 15%, so it's 115. So instead of everybody making $10,000 a month, now everybody makes $11,500. Now this is a very important thing, because it means that if I'm choosing between city A and city B, and city A is a 500,000 person city and city B is a 1 million person city, then on average, just me being exactly the same, nothing changing about me, I will make more money going to city B, about 15% more, bizarrely enough. And by the way, if there's a city C, it's a 2 million person city, on average, I'll make more money going to city C. Now, of course, what that means is that more likely I will choose the biggest city, which means the biggest city is going to tend to get bigger. And herein is the very powerful thing. In some very strong sense, cities are to people like stars are to atoms, meaning that there's a desire, in some sense, a gravitational attractor, to pack as many people as possible into the city. Because if you increase the population, then you increase things like wealth and, by the way, also innovation. So this gives rise to a very powerful dynamic, just like a star, by the way, where a star kind of wants to collapse to a singularity from the point of view of gravity, and then it's pushing against the electromagnetic force that prevents the atoms from getting any closer together than they can, and that gives you the dynamic of a star. Cities have the attractor of wanting to get more people in the city to increase the wealth and innovation and other variables. And it's facing the repulsor of, for example, constraints around, well, for one thing, people have physical bodies, so they have to be in space. There's only so many people you can pack into a particular piece of space. Or getting them food. There's only so much food you can produce in the city. If you're producing the food out of the city, you've got transportation. So if you can only walk, for example, then there's only so far you can bring food and water, etc. And also moving waste out of the city has constraints. And so what we see is a kind of a seeking on the part of cities to maximally use the technology that is available to them to overcome the limitations or the constraints of physical bodies, to pack as many human beings as possible into cities, to thereby get this superlinear growth in wealth and innovation and other characteristics, and then effectively running into the limits of that. So the Romans could build aqueducts, but the Babylonians couldn't build aqueducts, so they had a limit. When we invented the elevator, some of them could go up past 3 or 4 floors, where people could reasonably walk on stairs, and suddenly build skyscrapers and pack a lot more people into the same space. And, okay, next piece. This piece is, by the way, substantially more, let's call it theoretical. I'm extending this out. You create fragility. So the city is endeavoring to bring as many people into it. Notice that as it brings more people in, it gets more wealth and it gets more innovation. So it has the capacity to start trying to figure out how to solve problems. So again, there was a point at which Rome couldn't bring enough water in, but they could figure out how to build aqueducts. And they build these aqueducts and pull water from hundreds of miles away to be able to continue to support the population. Now here's the proposition. The proposition is effectively the entire population of a region is composed of the city and its support infrastructure. Right? So the hypothesis is that the city is trying to get as many people as possible into the center. And literally everything that isn't in the center is just support infrastructure. So if you look at the contemporary Western world in particular, you see something that looks like that. You've got giant cities that have sort of evaporated the population out of their local environment, created sort of population deserts, except for the location that can provide support infrastructure. And in some cases, that support infrastructure has to do with locations where people who really don't want to be in cities can still be. Okay, and then what happens is that the dynamic of packing more and more people and pushes it to the limits, which means that it's optimizing for the capacity to increase the number of people in the city, which means that it's becoming fragile. Logistics gets as intense as it can. Food distribution gets as intense as it can. Water distribution gets as intense as it can. You're also running into situations where, by the way, things like crime and disease also tend to increase super linearly. So you have to build techniques to try to reduce that vis-a-vis innovation. Like innovation and wealth are fighting against crime and disease. And so minor perturbation, as the system becomes more and more optimized for maximizing population under particular constraints of technology, and boom, you get a collapse. And then that collapse creates a collapse of the entire civilization. So by hypothesis, for example, I would propose that the collapse of the Roman Empire was in some very distinct sense the actual collapse of the city of Rome, and everything else was support infrastructure. Now that's a pretty bold claim, and I don't necessarily need to hang my hat too much on that last piece, but the key idea here is city, attraction, repulsion, dynamic as being fundamental to the nature of civilization. Until now. Because if you think about it, if you look at it deeply, what you might say, what I'm proposing, is that the core attractor is actually not the city. The dynamic is actually more abstract, and what we've seen in the city is really just the fact that human beings are embedded in bodies. The thing that really wants to happen, the real driver of the superlinear scaling metric is minds in relationship. Intelligence, distinct intelligences interacting through some mechanism. And it's because minds are embodied that we have cities. Right? Up until very recently, the only way for minds to interact is that you had to bring bodies relatively close to each other. And those are subject to the constraints of effectively travel. And now more recently, telecommunications. But telecommunications has been relatively weak, like a telegraph, telephone, television, right? These various kinds of media that create the possibility of interaction and relationship over non-physical distances have changed things a lot. But they still haven't been strong enough to overcome the possibility for relationship that exists in physical proximity. But now it looks like we may be either at or near the tipping point, where things like this medium, and more importantly, things like video conferences, and I strongly suspect the next wave of virtual reality, have enough possibility of relationship in the virtual that we can in fact decouple the attractor and the repulsor. So the civium is a concept based on that premise. Right? The civium is a concept that says, if we can render unto the virtual what is best done in the virtual, and render into the physical what is best done in the physical, and then bring those back into proper relationship, we can change the whole game. So what do I mean? What I mean is creative, generative collaboration in the virtual. And now here we can in fact have a single city. One place where all minds, at least in principle, can be in right relationship with each other. They can communicate, they can interrelate. No longer constrained in the same way by physicality. And by the way, this also means that we have to really be thinking very clearly about what are the right ways to bring those minds into relationship. How do we actually build this virtual environment so it's maximally generative? This is a whole new space. We have to take this seriously now because it's going to be not an adjunct to civilization, but a fully symmetric basis to civilization with the physical side. Now, by the way, this implies that we should get significant increases in wealth and innovation. If I can take the biggest cities in the world and increase them by, about 7 or 8 doublings, I'm increasing wealth by a lot. So, for example, if I were to take the population of Tokyo and now move that to include the entire human population, the average income would go up by about 3 or 5x, which is a lot. Okay, so that's one side. On the other side, when I have made this decoupling and now bodies are not being squeezed together because the body is the substrate for relationship, now the bodies can be returned to humanness, to a more humane way of living. Living in the Dunbar limit, living among people who you know well. strong link relationships, family, community, living in nature, making sure that the place that you're living is built at human scale, very walkable, very quiet, low toxicity, where you always have a relationship with being in the earth, being in nature. And by the way, I suspect that this is not just awesome. Not only does it give us back a whole bunch of values that we've had to give up in the context of the gluttony of the city, I suspect it's actually going to be obligate to enable the virtual to be as powerful as it needs to be. So, for example, I imagine most people now are experiencing the fact that interaction via the virtual, like let's say, for example, in a Zoom conference, is substantially more draining than interaction in the physical. Right? If I'm in a room of 12 people, I'm having a conversation with 12 people, for me at least, as an introvert, it's very draining. But it's draining, let's say, X. But if I have that same length of conversation with those same 12 people, but it's all on a Zoom call, it is substantially more draining. Let's say 2X. It's more like 5X, but whatever. Now, imagine if when you finish that Zoom conference, instead of dropping back into your body in the context that you're in now, you dropped into a context that is extremely nurturing for human beings. Right? You were able to go sit under a shade tree next to running water, maybe even swim in the water. Or you could go out and interact with people with whom you have very healthy relationship and do something together, like build a wall or dig in the garden or whatever it happens to be that is very human. How much more grounding that is and returns your nervous system back to a state of health so that you can then cycle back into the virtual and extend that creativity and that generativity, like this movement between the virtual and the physical now becomes something that we can really recouple in a right way and get a lot more out of it, and a lot more out of it that is healthy. So that's the notion. All right. So the idea here is that we can take this incredibly powerful generator of wealth and innovation that has been captured in the city, which has a whole bunch of characteristics of forcing us into situations that are increasingly inhumane, not healthy for humans, and pop that apart and increase it by a factor of 5 to 7 at the virtual level. So get something more generative than cities have ever dreamed of being, but at the same time, recover and get back all of the human scale living that we've had to surrender, and return to that sort of wholesomeness of life that many of us, I think, yearn for. And here we are. Right? We're in that pivot point. The quarantine has shown us, whether we like it or not, that many of the things that we have had to, or at least have thought we had to do in interaction, work environment, learning environments, much of that can be done virtually. In fact, depending on how the next several months play out, much of it will continue to have to be done virtually. So we're going to be having to learn those skills. And this gives rise to an opportunity to extend into that and to experiment and see, okay, what does that look like if we make that fundamental? And that's what we're doing. Gosh, 18 minutes, pretty long. Probably shoot this again in a different frame and see if I can make it shorter. But for those who chose to watch this till the end, I just hope it was worth it.